You're listening to the Joyous podcast with Mike Carden, where we talk to the world's most interesting business thinkers about life and work and life. Today's guest is Amy Edmondson. For show notes and other content referenced in this podcast, visit joyoushq.com/podcast. And now, here's Mike.
Hello, welcome to the Joyous Work podcast where we talk work and making work great. I'm Mike Carden, co-founder of Joyous, and my guest today is Amy Edmondson, Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School, renowned for many things, but certainly most famous for coining the term psychological safety. Named by Thinkers 50 in 2021 as the #1 management thinker in the world, if you haven't watched Amy's TED Talk, How to Turn a Group of Strangers into a Team, well, you're in the minority. She also has a brand new book out, Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. I'm a long-term fan. Amy, welcome to the podcast.
Mike, thanks for having me.
Hey, it's really great to have you. Hey, look, I love to start these podcasts, kick them off with the origin story, as Marvel would call it. So tell me, how did you start? What's the journey?
Oh my, the journey. Well, let's just say my journey started out with wanting to make a difference in our ever-challenging world. And that's, of course, probably what every young person wants to do. But maybe I didn't have quite enough skills to do that the hard way. Like my brother was a software designer and my father was an engineer. So I ended up finding my way into social science and suddenly having the insight that people are really the hardest thing, right? That sort of helping people grow and learn and work together is the original holy grail. We've got to figure out ways to make that work better. So I suppose you could say I was a good student. I was always a good student. So ultimately, how could I make my contribution? It would be in an academic setting. So I started out, I did study engineering undergraduate. I did work as an engineer, but found my way into consulting and people and got so excited about it and so aware that my skills were not where they needed to be that I then decided to go to graduate school 10 years after graduating from college here in the U.S. So turns out that's not normal. I thought I'm ready. Here I am. Like, teach me some new things. I want to be smarter. I want to be better. And much to my surprise, I was 8 years older than everybody, which was sort of interesting. But no matter, I learned a lot, and I learned so much that I ended up never leaving. So I stayed in academia and have been now on the faculty at Harvard Business School for more than 25 years.
Wow, that's a fascinating story. Hey, so look, your name is associated with psychological safety. I don't know if you get bored of that. I realize it's where there's a lot of research in that, but that's it.
I don't get bored of it. I definitely do not get bored of it. I get frustrated sometimes by the misunderstandings about what that means, what it's all about. But I never get bored of it because it seems to me the issue of psychological safety, or the issue of permission, a sense of felt permission to speak up and be candid, is so very fundamental to human psychology. Right? It's so challenging. If you take as a given, as I do, that the modern workplace, for instance, needs people to be willing to speak up about their ideas, about their concerns, when they've made a mistake or when they have a dissenting view. And that's literally necessary for excellence today. We all live and work in knowledge-based businesses or government agencies and so on. If that's necessary, then we really have to create that kind of environment. But that goes against so much of our wiring and our socialization, which leads us to want to hold back and to play it safe and to not offer an idea unless we're really confident that everybody's going to love that idea. Yeah.
It's a fascinating thing to me. You sort of birthed this thing almost, this idea that this is one of the most important things to make a company culture work. And now it becomes part of the lexicon of management speak, doesn't it? And then I must have heard quite a few different versions of it myself. I'm sure you hear a lot more.
Yes, I've been hearing over the last year or two of psychological safety. I mean, people are basically thinking it's the same thing as job security, which of course it isn't. It's permission for candor. It's openness. It's a learning environment. That's job security is a whole nother concept, which we could talk about. But it's where people think it's about being comfortable or happy. And it's not, right? In a way, it's more about being comfortable, being uncomfortable.
I think the other thing too, and you mentioned this in the new book, we'll come to the new book shortly, but I think that one of the ideas is that psychological safety is actually quite different to belonging, right? And I think that's one thing which I get. Yeah, I see confused quite a lot as well. Do you want to just talk about that for a second?
So belonging is a belief that you are a legitimate and welcome member of a community, of a group, which, of course, I think is a very important and valuable thing to experience. And belonging is far more likely to be present when you have psychological safety. But it's not the same concept. Psychological safety is a belief that you can speak up, you can take interpersonal risks. Right? And so it's interestingly, I think, it's a little bit a self-reinforcing relationship, right? Because if you have psychological safety, or if you have, if you have high belonging, you're more likely to feel comfortable expressing yourself. Because this is a place they can't kick out because I belong here. I'm a legitimate member of this group. So of course, it makes it easier to express myself. And if I am, if I am worried about belonging, if I'm worried about being sort of rejected, then that's the whole state of low psychological safety, right? It's almost definitionally accurate to say that a worry about being rejected is low psychological safety. And it's almost definitional to say that that high belonging is a belief that, okay, I really belong here. I'm allowed, I'm welcome here, even if things go wrong. So different constructs in practice, they will have a nice mutually reinforcing relationship with each other.
That's awesome. I've never really quite got that. So thanks for talking us through that. Hey, so look, there is a new book, Right Kind of Wrong, about failure, about failing well. Firstly, why? Why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote this book because I think we're still confused about failure. Right? There's lots of happy talk out there. There's entrepreneurship talk. There's a lot of sort of sayings. When you look up on the internet for famous failure quotes or just failure quotes, period, unlimited number of quotes like failures are stepping stones on the way to success, or Winston Churchill said success is just stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm, right? That kind of rhetoric is out there. I think deep in our hearts, most of us don't really buy it, right? And we shouldn't buy it, because most important point of all is that not all failures are alike. There are failures, in fact, that are worth preventing. And fortunately, many, if not most of them, can be prevented. And so it's the main idea of the book is to separate the good kind, the right kind of wrong, from the failures that we are right to feel unhappy about and to want to prevent, and to share some of the best practices for preventing the preventable kinds, but probably more importantly, to share ideas and practices for increasing our comfort level with the good kind, the intelligent failures, through which progress is made and adventures are had.
Yeah, there is a lot of kind of hackneyed phrases about failure these days, isn't it? So it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I'm a sports fan, love sports, and there's always this thing of you learn more from a loss than a win. That's like kind of like the way you make yourself feel better about a loss. But, losses hit you confidence. Like there's all sorts of other challenges with losses. So maybe
they have costs, right? But they also do have value. Right? But actually, I'm glad you brought up sports, because I think sports are the domain in which failures are unavoidable. Or you can't, you don't, if you fail every time you're out on the court, you won't last long in that sport. But even the champions of the world are failing some portion of the time. So I think sports are great for strengthening your failure muscles. It's just part of the activity you can't win them all.
Certainly when I played sport, I was strengthening my failure muscle quite a lot. In fact, I think there's a quote in your book from Billie Jean King, the famous tennis player, and her quote was, "For me, losing a tennis match isn't failure, it's research." And that kind of segues me, I guess, into the burning question for me is, when is failure a good thing? What does that look like when failure is a good thing?
So failure is a good thing when 4 criteria are met. Now, and I want to say to say that there's only one kind of failure that's really good is one thing, but it's not the same as saying that all other failures are bad, right? Or shameful. I mean, they're not good. They're not the right kind of wrong, but they're still human. So I want to come back to that. But so failures are good when they're in new territory, when they are in pursuit of a goal, when you've done your homework, you have an idea that something might work because you've thought about it, gotten the background information that you can. And then finally, when it's as small as possible, to still learn from. So, silly example, a blind date with someone that a friend thought you would like that doesn't work out, that's disappointing or worse, is an intelligent failure, right? You, in pursuit of a goal, maybe to meet someone, you did your homework, your friend told you, yeah, this is someone I think you might like. It's a new territory. There was no way to know for sure without meeting that person. And then finally, wasn't that big a deal. It's one evening or one coffee date, right? So it fits all the four criteria in a kind of life realm. Similarly, a failed clinical trial for a new cancer drug is also an intelligent failure. Pursuit of a goal, right? A new therapeutic in new territory, no way to know whether it works without those trials with those patients. As small as possible. They will never have more patients or bigger sized trial than necessary in order to learn what we can learn about its efficacy. And so very different realms, obviously, different orders of magnitude, but both of them are the kind of failure. Sure, we prefer success, no question about it. But those are the kinds of failures we have to learn to embrace, to say that necessary if we are serious about progress, if we're serious about moving forward. We have to be okay with the fact that our hypotheses won't be right every time.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, success is a kind of meandering path too, isn't it? There's just no way to know. Yeah, I know this just at an entrepreneurial level when you're building a business, that you start off down one path, and if it wasn't for the big experiments, yes, it's what I call them, the kind of big proof points, like you're never likely to do the course correction or even the kind of major pivots you need to grow something really, really great. Right? And I guess it's a lockstep with that idea.
Yes. And I think in order to know, when you said the big one, the sort of the bigger proof points, you've got a theory around what's a big proof point? What kind of pencils we're going to use? That's not a big proof point. You just buy some pencils. Who cares, right? But you've thought about what are the biggest areas of uncertainty that we have to answer thoughtfully in order for this business to succeed. And those are the bigger proof points. And yet still, they're no bigger than they have to be, right? You think about how big does this trial, this pilot, this test need to be to get us the information that we need to take the next step.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about on the Joyous journey. And when we started with Joyous, we were very technology focused, right? And one of the first things we focused on was this idea of how do we make the kind of, what was a survey? How do we make that idea of getting information, getting into dialogue with employees in our case? How do you make that 10 times better? That was kind of like the 10 times better than what existed, which was anonymous survey. So that was the original kind of thought. And I look back on it now, we had very weak hypothesis. I can't say that plural of that word. A very weak hypothesis, I'll use the singular, as to what they would actually be used for. And it's quite funny. It wasn't, we went out there, we literally went to the thing of getting some customers and saying, why don't you use this to measure engagement, which was wrong. There was much better places to use it. We ended up, of course, using it to understand operational things. And it feels like a kind of pivot, but actually it was just an unproven hypothesis that we had to kind of get through, and we had to use failure to get us there.
That's right. I mean, engagement didn't work, or it wasn't interesting enough, or it just wasn't adding enough value, but it was an absolutely legitimate possibility. I mean, everybody talks about engagement. We care about engagement, but it wasn't the best use of the software or this new way of communicating with employees in two directions, where it turns out that much better or more valuable for them to be able to communicate about aspects of the task that aren't working, right? Or aspects of the environment that are getting in the way with their ability to do the task. I mean, fantastic, right? But you can't do it just by sitting and thinking. You have to be out there sort of doing and trying things.
So full disclosure here for the audience, you're on the Joyous Advisory Board, and I love asking our advisors this, but what attracted you to becoming part of the Joyous journey?
It probably does date back to my early education and career experiences as an engineer. I'm frankly interested in how to make things work, right? How to solve the puzzles for things that don't work as well as they should. And one of the things that doesn't work as well as it should is sort of the employee experience with respect to the work they're supposed to do to create value for customers, whether those customers are external customers or internal facing customers. It's just an awful lot of complexity in the modern workplace. So I was interested in it seemed like a good hypothesis to me that the way you and your brother described the software and the interface was that, this would be a kind of way for people to report on and then get help with the things that aren't working, right? So that appeals to, of course, it also is a way to engage voice in a safer way, right? I think users of the Joyous tool are going to believe sincerely that their voice is being requested by this tool, right? That they're being asked to speak up about things that don't work or do work, but it's like, yep, it's a genuine invitation. And for me, with psychological safety, I've always been, the way you create it is you kind of clarify why voice is needed, and then you make voice easy, either through asking good questions or instituting structures and systems that all but require input because of their design. And then you have a productive response. So the third part with respect to Joyous is the tool. Do people, in fact, not only don't get punished for sharing what they're seeing, but that they, in a funny way, psychologically at least, get rewarded for sharing what they're seeing? Because that's sort of the third element that ensures that psychological safety is built.
Yeah, that piece of making voice easy is like just making it so that this piece where all employees have a voice just becomes kind of naturally part of the organization. It's also really, if you want to speed up the cycle of testing things and sometimes failing and learning from those mistakes, it's a brilliant way of doing that. Hey, coming back to the book for a second, what surprised you writing this book? You do a ton of research, you talk to lots of people. What's the most surprising thing for you?
Well, maybe the most surprising thing was, before I even got going, was that I was approached by someone who I really respect, who convinced me to write this book, right? Who convinced me that there was still a need. And my initial premise was, A, I've written some articles about this topic. B, there's lots of books out there on failure. I got a shelf of them. I don't think we really need another book about failure. She convinced me to just write a proposal about it. And in the process of writing the proposal, kind of got hooked, right? I kind of got interested in the opportunity to do more and share more stories and really drive home the difference between the intelligent failures and the other kind, and to really take a look at how we as humans struggle with this topic, but probably there are opportunities to have us struggle less. So I think the surprise was that Margot was right. The book needed to be written. And in the process of writing it, I learned a lot, as I always do in writing a book. And I feel that I really did manage to convey some messages and practices, ideas and concepts and practices that are useful, like surprisingly. So there is a way in which I can still be useful, which of course is my early desire, was to be useful.
Yeah, one of the things that really strikes me, and we touched on this at the very beginning of the chat, but the concept of that failure being good, like the fail fast kind of Silicon Valley talk or the sports example we use and so on, those are fairly well understood ideas. But gosh, it lacked a science, didn't it? There was really no one that had actually applied much scientific principle to the idea. Is that your feeling too?
I think that's right. I mean, that might not be quite fair, because I think that so much of what I'm saying is quite logical, but maybe no, it hadn't been put all together. So you can read books on failure proofing, right? You can read books on entrepreneurship and fail fast, or on innovation. But there wasn't one where it was all put together where, yes, if you want to look at this sort of fraught topic of failure, it applies across context. It has different relevance and resonance in different contexts versus others. But let's put it all together and sort of combine what we know about the science of failing well into one place. I don't think there's any new inventions in the book. There's a kind of certainly new stories and a comprehensive integration of a set of practices that haven't been put together in quite the same way.
The last chapter of the book kind of resonated with me the most, which is, it's titled Thriving as a Fallible Human Being. Yeah. And so this is the bit that fascinates me, is the kind of human piece of it. So Talk to me about failing as a human.
Well, there's threads of humans and humanity all the way through in every chapter. But I thought that the last chapter was a way to bring those threads together and walk out back of the book together with the reader, which is, so this idea of thriving as a fallible human being. I think first and foremost, this means, like it or not, recognizing that each and every one of us is a fallible human being. That's just truth, right? That's just the truth. And the only question, we can't control that, whether we're fallible, we are. but we can control how we think about it. Like is that just awful and shameful and embarrassing? Or is that part of our birthright? And let's go forward together. Let's do the very best we can as fallible people in a fallible world, right? So that was the idea. And it's full of stories, of course, but practices about what are some of the ways to thrive despite our fallibility. And it has to do with resilience and, believe it or not, mastering the art of a good apology, right? Since we are going to get things wrong, it's going to be important that we know how to apologize. But of course, importantly, maybe even most importantly, is not to be afraid of taking risks. Because if we're afraid of taking risks, we hold ourselves back and we end up sort of playing it safe and robbing ourselves of adventure, progress, advancement, and I think even joy.
Yeah. So I this idea of living with failure and remaining joyous, failure still hurts, right? There are still situations where you want things to succeed and then they don't succeed, and particularly if it impacts people, which often happens in business, like it gets you right in the gut, right? So how do you kind of keep your chin up even?
Wait, the way I answer that is by looking to the people who really do this for a living. And for the moment, I won't go to the elite athletes. Let's go to the people whose bread and butter is intelligent failure. Those are scientists, inventors, like real innovators on the leading edge of any field, practical or scientific. And they're the people who have to endure failure far more than the rest of us. So a very high-performing chemistry lab in a university might be failing 90% of the time, right? So then to answer the question of how do you cope with that, let's go to them. Let's find out how they cope with it. And the answer is, part of this is obvious. They live for the 10%, and they know they cannot get there without the 90. It's as if you decided you wanted to play tennis but never have to hit the ball. Doesn't work, right? So if you want to play tennis, you have to be willing to hit the ball with your racket, right? So if you want to play chemistry at the very leading level, you have to be willing to have a high percentage of your hypotheses be wrong and have experiments that fail. And so you relish the 10%. Of course, you celebrate the big breakthrough discoveries in the scientific papers and top journals and so on. But you train yourself to say to the failure ones, thanks for the information. Just thanks for the update. Thank you for the great new knowledge that nobody on the planet yet has except me about how Mother Nature actually behaves. And you take that new knowledge and it becomes new input to your next hypothesis. And with sort of luck and skill and speed, you're then doing that next experiment before anyone else figured that out. And maybe that's the one that works. So they don't wake up in the morning and go, ugh, I'm going to fail today. But they are. But they wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to get new discoveries today. Sure, they prefer the positive discoveries, the discoveries where they were right in their hypothesis and that brand new idea or outcome is publishable and off they go. But they learn to truly appreciate the value of the stepping stones along the way.
Yeah, I think that this idea of kind of joy in failure, right? That you can kind of celebrate the knowledge that you learn from a mistake. But also, I find personally too that one of the big things that happens is that certainly in my work, is that you typically end up failing as a team more often than failing as an individual, right? You have a hypothesis, you're all working on it, and you use that failure. You've got to be good at kind of being collective in the failure of actually going, hey, look, we all thought this. You don't want to get into that thing of, oh, I said this was going to fail, and like that thing that can so easily happen, right?
That's such a key point. And I'm glad you brought it up because really, I think part of what makes this all tolerable and okay is being with others, right? So it's almost, we can tolerate anything if we're in it together, right? It's disappointing, but at least you're here, I'm here, we're disappointed together, and we can kind of roll up our sleeves and figure out what next. And I've had that experience many, many times where, say, a scientific paper, as I've submitted it with maybe colleagues or students, PhD students, so we submit it to a journal, top journal, and gets rejected, right? Not please revise and resubmit, but just out and out rejected. That's a failure. And you're not allowed to send it back. And you feel terrible, you feel lousy, but you have each other and you sort of say, well, that stinks, right? And you're allowed to whine for a few minutes and sort of how they just don't get it. They don't get our brilliant paper. But pretty quickly you've got to move on from the whine and figure out what next, which is fine. But honestly, doing that with other people is so much more fun than just doing it all by yourself. So I think that's why it being a team that often fails is not incidental. I think that's super helpful and important.
Hey, I'm going to quote the book here. This is like my favorite quote reading through this. We can learn to live joyfully with our fallibility. Though it may seem counterintuitive, failure can be a gift. One of its gifts is the clarity a failure can bring about, which of our abilities need work. Another gift is insight about our true passions. And so I love the fact that the two things in there, right? The gift about our true passions true passions, should I say, and where we should work. Just from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Yeah, what does that mean to you? What do those two sides of failure mean to you?
Well, I mean, certainly in my earlier career and life as a student, I found the things that I was better at and the things that I was less. Here's the thing. In high school, it's easy, or not easy, but it's possible to be good at everything, right? It's because it's very much, here's the material, please learn it, come take the test, show that you've learned it. And so it turns out you can be under the mistaken belief in high school that you're really good at maths and physics and all the rest. And sure, you're able to kind of master a certain degree of material. That is not the same as being somebody who's really just born to do. So, and that same is true in sports, and the same is true in any field. And sometimes it takes a good failure experience to realize that the universe is sending you a message, right? That this is and maybe it's not just that you're not good at it, but that really your heart isn't in it, right? Sometimes we come up short on things because we don't prepare enough or don't put enough effort into it. And that's often a signal that maybe there are things that you would really bring you more joy and bring the world more value if you put your attention over there.
So in closing, Amy, are you living joyfully with your fallibility?
Oh, never. I'm a work in progress. As my former friend and mentor and employer one time, Buckminster Fuller, said, I seem to be a verb. I'm not a noun, I'm a verb, right? I'm ever unfolding. But I think I am better and better at living joyfully with my own fallibility. But
on that note, we'll bring this to a close. Thank you so much for your time on the podcast. It's really, really been fascinating. And to anyone listening who wants to find the book, I'll put the link in there. But I should get the name of the book right. Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well, Amy Edmondson. Definitely worth the read. You'll learn a lot more than you think about. It's not a dry academic tome, let me put it that way. There's a lot. I learned about the history of champagne. Anyway, we must go. Thank you again, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
This has been the Joyous Podcast, brought to you by Joyous. Human conversations and AI analytics in one. Find out more at joyoushq.com. If you liked this show, make sure to give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to join us for our upcoming podcast with Kim Scott, best-selling author of Radical Candor. This episode of the Joyous Podcast was hosted by Mike Carden and produced by Kai Crow, Karen Rayner, and Brandon Berman. Thanks for joining us. And remember, everyone deserves to be joyous.